Welcome, everyone. I am Claire Yu, former chair of the Center for Korean Studies. The current chair, Laura Nelson, is away on sabbatical, so I'm standing in for her. Her welcoming message is in the booklet, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce this Shijo event. Not only this Shijo event, but the Venerable Musan Snim. Who was very difficult to travel, but he made a special occasion to come here today. I have been told that true to the Buddhist practice, he would not, or he shuns any accolades or praise, but I must, for the sake of those who gathered here today, make a few remarks, even if they don't do justice for all the things he has done. Born as Oh-hyun in the 1930s, he has lived all of his 80 plus years in Buddhist temples, taking Musan, the fog mountain, as his Buddhist name. He later became the Venerable Musan Snim, the patriarch of the Korean Choge order of the Sun Meditation Hall at Baekdam Temple. As a young monk in the late 1960s, Oh-hyun found interest in Shijo poetry and started writing Shijo poems, eventually advancing the unique genre of Korean poetry known as Shijo, Sun Shijo, of which we will hear today the discussions, readings, and recitations and singing later in the program. His contribution to Korean literature did not end there. As he took his residence at Baekdam Temple, he initiated the Manhae Foundation, which promotes Korean cultural events, and also he started Manhae Festival, which is very well known, one of the best known Korean cultural events in Korea. And he also, the Manhae Foundation that he started was to celebrate the Buddhist monk poet Manhae Han, who was the Buddhist poet as well as patriot. And he has been very contributing author of many poems. Let's see. He also studied Manhae Award to celebrate and to award all the deserving people from all around the world, including Nelson Mandela and Moyan and many others. I'd like to note that among the past Manhae Awards recipients are today's keynote speaker, Professor David McCann, and former U.S. Poet Laureate Robert Hass, and Professor Emeritus Louis Lancaster, as well as the current visiting Professor Kwon Young Min. It is not hard to see why the Venerable Musan Snim is with us today. Although he is a man of religion, Today we celebrate him for his artistry and poetry, though the two are inseparable for him. His unique talent for Shijo poems, which the speakers will be discussing and reading in a few moments, has brought him many awards, of which I will not mention. His salient works include the commentary to Pak Amnok, the conversation dialogue between Emperor Wu and the Bodhidharma, the commentary to Pak Yugyeong, the Fable Sutra, in addition to Sun dialogue and the Gateless Gate. As Professor Kwon tells us, Oh-hyun's Shijo poems illuminate the ways of governing the words. He leaves only the absolutely essential words after pruning and selecting the frivolous. And you will see also his Shijo poems epitomize the ultimate goals of Sun. That's according to Professor Kwon. When we read the tales of the temple, Musan S님's voice is sui generis. The voice of mountains, the trees, fog-hugging valleys, the gurgling stream, the dirt kitchen with dead branches crackling to heat the temple floor, and the chimney, smoke rising, dissipating into the cold air. All these make appearance in his poems. You can hear, see, and feel them. I especially like the wrinkled man narrating his sad complaints of the temple monks' mistreatment in the CHOL dialect, whose words and strong provincial accents transport you to a different time and different place. Luckily for us today, the Venerable Musan Snim's work was gathered and painstakingly annotated by Professor Kwon and is available to us in a single volume titled For Nirvana, The Complete Works of Oh-hyun. It is not a commercial publication. It is given only as a gift to those who love poems and all of you in attendance today. I'd like to conclude my opening remarks by reading Musan Snim's Shijo, written for and presented at the World Peace Poets Forum in 2005 in Seoul. 삶의 즐거움을 모르는 놈이 죽음의 즐거움을 알겠느냐? 어차피 한 마디 기는 벌레가 아니더냐? 이 다음 숲에서 사는 새의 먹이로 가야겠다. It goes like this, something like this in English. Without knowing the joy of life, can I know the joy of death? After all, aren't I just a crawling bug? I will leave this world as food for the birds in the woods. And we're hoping Professor Robert Hass would be here and give a little opening remarks as well, but he had some emergency and could not be here. And before we move on to the the program. I'd like to thank Professor Kwon for his tireless endeavor for bringing this event here today. And also many thanks to, Stephanie Kim and Yoon-hee Kim and Jae-young Chang, librarian. And here is the next keynote speaker, Professor David McCann, and followed by Professor Heinz Insu Fenkel. Please let's welcome David McCann.
Thank you so much, and to all of you, thanks for coming this afternoon. I have to extend my deep thanks to Professor Kwon Young-min, not only for this afternoon's gathering, but for all that he has done over the decades to build the field of Korean literature and appreciation for Korean literature outside of Korea as well as within. He was a great help to me and an encourager of my efforts from the very beginning of my work in the field of Korean literary studies. So my thanks to Professor Kwon. I don't know if I'm doing that or if it's just the sparks. I'd also, though, like to extend thanks to Oh-hyun, the Sejong poet, who has been an incredible model for a very different path in the Sejong today. And I feel like an absolute neophyte in so many ways as I follow his poetry and the track of it in the Korean language, but then also in the English language as well. And I will extend thanks to him again when he is here. But last also, I'd like to extend my thanks to the poet, the Sejong poet, Hong Song-nan, who has been a real inspiration in her Sejong, and then also in all that she is doing in order to enhance the understanding and appreciation of the Sejong, both inside Korea and outside, at this place, for example. Or a few years ago at a similar gathering at Harvard University, and my deep thanks. I became interested in Korean literature when I was in Korea in the Peace Corps. I went there in, it seems like 1820, but it was really 1966 in the first group to go. And I was in the town of Andong, teaching at Andong Nongnim Chogomakyo. I was teaching English conversation to classes of 65 students at a time, because that was the national law limit on the class size. It couldn't be less than that, it couldn't be more. And also I was learning something about Korean life in a town outside of Seoul. And one day I happened to go into a little bookstore and I saw a book with a red cover. And in those days, there were no books that had red covers because there was a very strong anti-leftist culture and legal practice. You could get in big trouble for a book with a red cover. And it's so different these days to hear all the shouts of "Baoyangi, Baoyangi," right? Shouting enthusiastic support for the team. In the old days, if you said somebody was a Baoyangi, that meant they were a communist spy of some kind. And so I was just fascinated to see this book, took it off the shelf, and found that I was holding a translation of some poems by the poet Kim So-wook. And on one page would be the original poem, and on the facing page, the translation by Professor Kim Dong-sung, who taught for many years at the College of Education at Seoul National University. And I thought to myself, as I looked at the book, this might be a good way to get better at the Korean language, because I can read the English and then look at the Korean and just step by step improve my vocabulary and get a sense for how the language works in poetry, because poetry was something that I had loved forever and ever. And I started reading those poems, and they just wove a magical spell over me. And I began to learn them. Of course, Jindalekot and Monhunnai and many, many others. And what I discovered then was that whenever I had a question about a poem by Kim So-wol, wherever I happened to be, in the teacher's room at Andong Nongbo, or maybe having a bit of makgeolli in town with some teachers or others, or on the train up to Seoul, or wherever else, I was able to ask Koreans I met, how can I understand this poem? 나보기가 역겨워 갔을 때는 말없이 거기 보내들이 으리다. 영변의 악산 진달래고 아름다운 가시 길에 뿌리 으리다. And I said, what is 뿌리 으리다? And they, oh, you know so well, you know our language. And they would, with great delight, explain that poem to me. And it drew me deeper and deeper into a real fascination and then love for Korean poetry. And as I began understanding a little bit more about those poems, I began to read other poets from the 1920s, and I began to think maybe I should study this in graduate school, which is what I then did. And as I was studying, I noticed that people talked about Kim So-wol as having used folk song poetry as a pattern, as a model in his modern poems from the 1920s. And I was wondering, what is a minyo shi? And Jindalegot, if you look in Kabyuk magazine, where it was first published, has a little label under it, minyo shi. And I thought, what could that possibly be? So I began to read a bit about minyo, and then I began to think, there's minyo, but I see here also there was shijo and kasa. And so I thought I should study these pre-modern forms so that I can better understand where the modern poetry came from and how. And I went back to Korea after a couple of years in graduate school and was studying shijo and kasa and minyo and modern Korean poetry. I was having a meeting with the associate dean of Korea University with a letter of introduction to study there as a visiting student. And he looked at the letter written by my thesis advisor, Professor Edward Wagner, and it said that I was going to study modern poetry, but also shijo and kasa and minyo and so on. And this gentleman was sitting at his desk in his office, and he looked at the letter, and then he looked at me, and he said, "You're studying shijo?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And I couldn't even go on with it. He said, "Oh, you mean like this? 청산!" And I was astonished, because here was an academic administrator sharing the shijo in a performance with me, a visiting student. And it just gave me again a sense of how alive the Korean poetic tradition really is. And that's something that I've been exploring ever since then. A couple of years ago, I teach a class called Writing Asian Poetry. And we study classical Chinese poets, Libo and Dufu, and then we do haiku by Basho, and then we move to shijo, and the students write in those forms. And one day I was thinking to myself, a lot of people write in the way of classical Chinese poets. A lot of people write in haiku form. Not many people write shijo. And so I was having the students try to write shijo, try some shijo. And they found it rather challenging, but they enjoyed it. Particularly, you have a first line in a shijo, gets it started, and a second line keeps it going, and then you have a twist, and then a conclusion. And the students would say that twist is hard, because it's got to connect, but it's got to go in a different direction for a moment, and then come back to the poem. And one student in the conversation in the class was saying, you don't want it to be like a refrigerator falling out of the sky into your poem. It's got to have a connection. Well, we did that for a while, and one day I was thinking, gee, Shijo in English, the students are doing it. Why don't I try? And so I started writing a Shijo one day in a restaurant in Harvard Square. And I wrote my first English language Shijo, which goes like this. I was just looking at the lobsters in a tank by the door. And I picked up a pen and grabbed a napkin and wrote, all through lunch from my table, I keep an eye on your disputes. Green lobsters in the bubbling tank by the restaurant door. Slights, fights, bites, whatever the cause, make peace and flee. Escape with me. And for 2 years after that, I wrote nothing but Shijo in English. And this little book is the result. It was published by Bo Leaf Press. It's called Urban Temple. And Bo Leaf Press is run by Insu Fenkel's wife. And so I'm delighted also to extend thanks to her and their daughter, Bella, who did this beautiful illustration. Well, I'll come back to this Shijo in a minute after some about real Korean Shijo. But the last one that I want to just share with you for a moment is called One for Anne. And Anne happens to be sitting there, my wife. We met in Korea on the way in the Peace Corps days. And we were back there together with our daughter a few years after that when we were there as I was studying the Korean Shijo. And she has always been a warm supporter of my efforts to do work with the Shijo form. And I was up in Seattle, Washington, and wrote this one. Like a squirrel digging nuts up, or those crows turning dead leaves over, I go places and take poems. This one from the back seat of the cab on the way to the airport. When I get home, it's all yours. And I felt with this Shijo poem that I was really moving into a new direction, a new way of expressing my thoughts and my feelings in this form from Korea in English. Let me share with you then a few observations about that form in Korean and its history. You may not know, but there have been other books of Shijo written and published in English. This one, Tap Dancing on the Roof, a collection of poems for children by Linda Sue Park. And it's got great illustrations and then nice English language Shijo poems. The red flag waves its stern warning, danger, no swimming today. The ocean churns, foams, roars, dashes, hurls huge breakers at the sand. The next day, it's all tired out and takes a long nap in the sun. It's a lovely poem, and our granddaughter enjoyed hearing it read. This is a collection of poems that was sent to me by a poet in Europe. And former United States Ambassador Kathleen Stevens had an idea of her own about Shijo writing in English. She held a contest for students at the English language academies in Korea and invited them to send in a poem, a Shijo poem written in English, and become qualified to take this exam. And it was hosted at her residence in Seoul, and it was in the old style of the Confucian state examinations. They sat on the floor, they were given a word or a theme, and then they wrote some poems. And there were several judges of those poems, including Professor Kwon Young-min and me and the poet Ko-un and his wife, and we read and picked out some poems that we thought worked well. As some of you no doubt know very well, the shijo is in 3 lines, roughly 45 syllables, in a general pattern of syllable distribution as is shown here in this diagram, but there are variations in the size, 2 to 5, 3 to 6. You'll see variation in the numbers of syllables in the 4 parts of the line, except at the beginning of the 3rd line, that twist, where it's almost always 3 syllables. And it's as if it's saying, we have to get 3 so that we can do that twist. And it's got a very strong sort of gesture to it. 1, 2, 3, then we finish the poem. One of the earliest shijo poems that we have is by the Koryo statesman Jung Mongju, who died in 1392. The story about the poem is that he was a loyalist to the Koryo, would not go over to the Yi family side as they were trying to put together a coalition to found a new dynasty. So they invited him to a banquet, and in the middle of the banquet, one of the sons of Yi Sung-ge, the founder of the dynasty, stood up and offered a shijo poem as a kind of provocation. Why don't you just relax like the vines on Mansu Mountain and unwind, and you can live 100 years or more? Well, there's a threat in that line. If you don't relax and go along with the changes, you will not live 100 years. In fact, you won't see tomorrow. Because the story is that Jung Mongju was killed on his way home from the banquet. But his response, and what led to his death in that story, is this poem. Though this body die and die, it may die 100 times. My white bones become but dust. What's called soul exist or not. For my Lord, no part of this red heart would ever change. How could it? It's a very powerful poem, a clear statement of his loyalty. But what I think needs to be better appreciated in this poem is the incredible dissection that it imposes on the human being. It starts with the body and takes that away, lets the bones turn to dust, a soul vanish. What's left is 일편단심, one piece red heart. And toward my Lord 임향한 일편단심이야. It will never change. And it's a performance. It's almost like an autopsy of what humans mean in their lives. Very, very powerful shijo poem, and I think wonderfully expressive of this performance dimension that's there in the shijo. Not just singing, but dance and gesture and movement. Here's another example by CHOL, a 16th century Confucian official who was in a lot of factional conflict at the time as the new dynasty was trying to set itself up in a strong ruling position and at the same time push Buddhism off to the side and up into the mountains, because the Koryo dynasty had been very closely associated with Buddhism. The Yi dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, made its mark with Confucianism. So at that moment, here is a shijo poem by CHOL. This one we know the author CHOL wrote because it's collected in his own works of writing published not long after his death in the Songgang Kasa, the poems of Songgang, who was CHOL. This is a translation by Richard Rutt. A shadow strikes the water below. A monk passes by on the bridge. Stay a while, Reverend Sir. Let me ask you where you go. He just points his staff at the white clouds and keeps on his way without turning. I should say that Richard Rutt was the Anglican bishop to Korea and did a wonderful collection of Shijo poems, The Bamboo Grove, translated into English many years ago. This is one of those, but I think he's being too polite in his translation. Let's look at the original. 물 아래 그림자 지니 다리 위에 중이 간다. So, into the water a shadow falls. Over the bridge a monk is passing. Notice the gesture in that. A shadow in the water. A monk on the bridge. It's got this movement built into it that I think Psy could do a wonderful Gangnam style Shijo performance with this. It's got a lot of this going on in it. But then listen to the second line in the Korean. Does he say, stay a while, Reverend Sir? Let me ask you where you go? No. He says, 저중아, 거 있구나. 너 가는데 물어보자. It's very threatening language, very direct, very plain speech. It's a Korean Confucian official ordering a monk to stop right there and let me check your credentials. Where are you going? It's incredible to think this voice comes to us in the vernacular language from the 16th century. This is how you heard things then. It's an amazing kind of recording. It's like on the cell phone. 저중아! That's the message that he leaves. What does the monk do? 막대로 흰 구름 가리키며 돌아 아니 보고 가노매라. So what's the monk do? He's walking along. He leaves a message. He points. It's a gesture. He doesn't turn around and answer. If he had done that, boy, there could have been a real fight. He could have wound up somewhere that he would not want to be. And instead of answering, he keeps on his way, saying, that's where I'm going. That's an amazing dramatic interaction between those two figures. It's also amazing to me in the 21st century to read it and to realize CHOL, the person who challenged that monk, left that poem for us to read. Centuries and centuries later, the poem in which the monk responds by saying, forget it, that's where I'm going. It's a very, again, powerful kind of extra historical statement and gesture. It's just something you don't often find in poetry. And then this third, by Hwang Jinhee, a 16th century Kiseng woman poet, Jade green stream, don't boast so proud of your easy passing through these blue hills. Once you have reached the broad sea, to return again will be hard. While the bright moon fills these empty hills, why not pause, then go on, if you will. And in the Korean, 정사리 벽해수야, 수위감을 자랑 마라. I'll show you a text of it in the next slide, but what's interesting, among other things, is the first half of each line is in Chinese characters. The second half of each line is in pure vernacular Korean. And it's as if the two realms of Chinese language and Korean language are bouncing against each other. A little bit like the one by CHOL with the Buddhist monk there. 일도 장애하면 다시 오기 어려우니 명월이만 공산하니 휴학한들 어떠라. Once you reach the broad sea, to come back again will be hard. The bright moon, Myeongwol, fills these empty hills. So why not pause and then go on, if you will. And as many of you know, I'm sure, the story about this Shijo is there was a fellow, a member of the aristocracy, Yangban, who had said he was totally immune to the charms of this very accomplished Kiseng woman in the 16th century. And he happened to be going somewhere near where she lived, and she somehow got this poem to him. And in it she is saying to him, don't be so proud of easily passing through. And Pyeokgae-su can mean jade green stream. Pyeokgae-su is the jade green stream. It's also, with different Chinese characters, the title for an office in the government. And so in a way it's speaking to you, official of the government. Don't be proud of going by me so easily, because once you're gone, you are gone. Myungwol, and Myungwol was her Kiseng name. I am here, filling the hills. So why not pause and then go on, if you will. And when people told me about this Shijo poem at Andong Agriculture and Forestry High School, they loved to tell me how when the Pyeokgae-su heard it, he fell off his donkey in the middle of the stream crossing, and he went to see Myungwol. You can also read it, though, as a reflection on life for all of us. As we rush around doing all the things that we're doing, so busily and busily and busily, once we reach that other broad sea, the next world beyond this one, beyond this life, it's not easy to come back. So while the bright moon fills the empty hills, pause and look around, and then go on, if you will. So it's got kind of a philosophical, you could say, expression, idea in it. And I think of this poem when I remember my last telephone conversation with the Korean poet Sejong in the summer before he passed away. I had arranged to go out and visit with him. I got to know him quite well. But when I got to the house, he and his wife were not able to get to the front gate, and there was no way to reach them. And so we left. I was with a friend, a professor also at Seoul National College of Education. But on the way, we called up and spoke. And he said, Yodaome, Yodaome. And for me, that's what's in this poem, that there isn't a Yodaome, because Sejong passed away soon after that. This is the poem, and I don't know if you can see, but on the left-hand side of those lines, that's the Chinese character part of it, and on the right-hand side is the pure Korean. And then in this transcription of the musical performance, you can see across the top the lines and the circles that gives you the drum pattern. Kung, 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 kung. And then below it, you see the words of the Shijo, and then that wavy line is the voice, the pattern of the voice. It's not written out on a melodic scale, but it gives you a good sense of what it would sound like. It's like a sound recording. It's, I think, a very wonderful demonstration of that aspect. Well, all of this got me thinking about other ways to think of the poetry of the Shijo and how to explore it. And one is through visual representations of something similar. I happened to be up on the Nakdonggang visiting an old Confucian home, and looking out one day, took some photographs, and here, Cheongsari Berkeley Suya, deep blue stream in these blue hills. Don't be so proud of your easy passing. Once you reach the broad sea, to come back again will be hard. While the bright moon fills these empty hills, why not pause, then go on, if you will. And I would think people who are interested in the Shijo might be also interested in finding ways to illustrate the Shijo. If you're in a place that means something to you, you can write, but you can also draw, you can paint. And those two, I think, go together rather nicely. After I made the photograph and put it here, I noticed this photograph of a beach on the east coast of Korea. What do you see in the background? It's a dragon, isn't it? From the right, his back and his neck and his head and his snout going out into the water. I was just amazed. The landscape of Korea has got this strong sense of energy in it and of life in it. And then, of course, all those young school kids heading back to their bus after the visit. And then...
3543.
Sorry?
3543. The pattern.
Where? Here?
The kids.
Oh, I didn't even think to look. 3, 5. You're right. Yeah. That those patterns are there. If you read from right to left, right. Yeah. 3, 5, 4, 3. Perfect. We were at a party, a cookout, at a teacher's house, professor's house, in the town outside of Seoul, and I took a sequence of photographs of the young people playing with their frisbees, and looking at this, I thought, oh, 청사리 벽계수야 수익함을 자랑 마라. And then 일도 장해하면 다시 오기 어려워라, and so on. But you can think of playing that way with the shijo and its performance dimensions. They're amazing. Well, the thing I wanted to share with you, and then head towards the last part that I'll do here. The Sejong Cultural Society in Chicago for 10 years now has been hosting a shijo writing contest for students in middle school and high school. And I've been a member of the judging panel ever since it started. And this one I thought was a good one from 2009, Secret Song. You ask me what I'm humming, I tell you I'm humming about nothing. This is untrue because I'm humming about you all day long. Who am I to tell you you're nothing when you are my song? I just love the way that turns around and becomes a poem about a poem, a shijo song. This by a 10th grader in Texas. It's really got the spirit of it. And then this one I like. Back in the first few years of the contest, it was only for high school students. And this one happened to win in a tie for third place back in 2008. Dreams on a Lake. I'm floating on the dark lake, dreaming I'm floating on a cloud, the surface of my tan skin tingling as water dries on it. A man yells, "Hello, good neighbor," breaking my dreams to pieces. It's a lovely poem, and it's got that sense. A man yells, and then the voice, like CHOL back in the 16th century, it's got a lot of drama to it. By a guy named Michael Jung. When I read, as we got the biographical information about the prize winners, as I read about his, I jumped up and ran around the first floor of our house shouting in surprise and astonishment and glee for a couple of reasons. One is, this guy Michael Jung explained that his older brother was in high school and came home one day with a description of the shijo contest. And he took a look at it and said, "Why not? I'll give it a try." And so he sent it in. And nobody caught the fact that he was just a 5th grader and therefore not really eligible to take part in the contest. But then he got word that he had tied for 3rd place. And he went down the hall to tell his grandmother, who was there at their home, that he had tied for 3rd in a shijo contest. And what made me jump up and start running around the house shouting in joy was, he said in his little note, she turned and looked at him and she said, "Well, of course you won a prize. You are a 16th generation descendant of CHOL." And I thought, oh, goodness, what a tale. let me see if I can do I have 2 minutes? 3? Thinking about different ways in which a shijo might work. I thought, I was in Florence. Anne and I were there in October, just a few months ago, and we were sitting in the big piazza there in the center of town where everybody goes, at a very well-known, what was the name of it? The cafe? I can't think, but it's one that I think even Hemingway enjoyed. And so I got out my iPad and I started it up, and this, I will tell you, is a visual shijo. Here we go. You can see why I think that's fun. Now, how do I get this to go down? Well, in any event, that's that for that. But one last, if I may, iteration of the shijo. You'll find out soon that I don't do this very well. And so I'm hoping that there are some of you who do know how to play the guitar or other instruments, because what I discovered was that if you take almost any Western song in the blues tradition or pop music or other kinds, you'll find that the words of the shijo move very easily into the other melody and kind of give it a new and I think somewhat interesting expression. And so now I'll try this. Bear with me. It's called Route 66. If you should chance to travel west, take my way, the highway that is best. Get your kicks on Route 66. 청사리 벽에 수야 수익감을 자랑마라. 일도 장애하면 다시 오기 어려워라. Thank you.
Our next keynote speaker is Heinz Frankel, and he's going to talk about the untranslatable, translating the untranslatable. So far, it was about Korean shijo.
Thank you. Since we're running overtime, let me quickly begin by thanking everybody for making this possible, and especially to Oh-hyun S님 for coming all the way from Korea. He usually doesn't leave his retreat. And the booklet outside, the 49 Shijo, this is a 108 copy limited edition that was permitted us to publish for this conference. So make sure you get a copy. It's a collector's item. And Joseon will be around later to sign it. So I wanted to talk today about why I translated these poems, and also the process of translation, especially of these shijo, which were quite unusual even in the Korean. And I think if you look at the introduction in this book, Professor Kwon actually does a very good job of talking about some of the unique features of Musan Joyeon Shijo in Korean, and especially the innovation which he calls Yagijo, the story Shijo, because one of the unusual things that Joseon is able to do is to mix prose and poetry in a way that's, I guess you could say it's seamless, and you may not even realize that you have read a shijo, but the delivery is so matter-of-fact and often folkloric. Okay? So my initial approach to translating Master Cho's poems was done in the traditional way, that is, with an eye towards both lexical correspondence and equivalency of meaning in the target language. That's what you hear in translation theory a lot. The target language here happens to be English. And several of the poems in this volume, for example, As I Look Upon Myself, follow that method. And they also represent how I applied some of the syllabic constraints of the shijo form into English to parallel the original structure. And one of the great things about shijo is that unlike Japanese haiku, where the syllabic constraints are really narrow, it's a much more flexible form. So you can actually translate a shijo into English and follow the syllabic constraints. So I did some of them that way. But I soon found that a traditional rendition in the target language just couldn't do justice to the poems. So the approach I had to take was more like Zen archery. And the issue wasn't just the linguistic complexity in the original poems. It was that even underlying all those layers of wordplay and the superposition of imagery, and this is because Joseon writes shijo, he writes it in Hangul, but at the same time, he might as well be writing them in Hanja. So the way he learned language wasn't the traditional way. He learned all of that together. He was initially illiterate. So the shijo are even written differently than traditional shijo. And even with all that superposition of imagery, his poems are fundamentally part of his practice, which means they're Zen poems. In Korean, that would be son. And trying to understand them in Korean required an approach that was more like tackling a Zen koan, or a kongan. And a Korean kongan is generally built around something called the hwadu. That's sometimes translated as a head word. And it's like the point on which the whole koan will spin. Okay? Or if you think about it more accurately, it's like a seed crystal onto which the meaning of the poem and even the imagery crystallize, and it sort of blooms like a mandala. And a kongan is notoriously difficult. It's not a test of one's rational intelligence, and despite all the many commentaries and cribs and solution books that you can find these days, a kongan engages one's full being, and its comprehension is reflected in the full being of the student. What appears as the verbal solution is just an epiphenomena. So you can think you solved the kongan and go to the master, and unless you manifest that solution, you have failed. Okay? So the solution in language is just epiphenomenal. So when you're reading the shijo originally in Korean, even the language in Korean is epiphenomenal. There's something else in there and it changes every time you look at the poem. So Chosunim's poem have that similar quality. On the one hand, their surface is easy to read and comprehend, very smooth in the source language. They have a narrative quality, their allusions, their use of understood tropes, all of that allows one to arrive at an apparent poem without much deep reflection. They can be appreciated aesthetically on the first pass, but the first pass only reveals a single layer or facet of the poem, which then leaves a kind of resonance, an image, a word, a phrase, and will linger sort of naggingly in your memory like an echo, and then that would bring you back to the poem to read it again, and then you discover another layer, another theme, or even a whole other poem there. And then this process happens again. And each time the process produces, for me, as I did this in the Korean, each one of those takes would have produced a wholly different translation. And since the associative layering of words and images in Korean is different from English, the discrepancy between those translations in some cases would have been quite great. Now, one can say what I just said about poetry in general, of course, if you're thinking theoretically, but it's amplified to a remarkable degree in Chosunim's work. And one must remember that Zen poetry is inherently ironic, since the basic tenet of Zen is antithetical to text. Zen is the direct transmission of Buddhist teaching without reliance on words or symbols. But Zen practice also understands the ironic necessity of language as a means of communication. After all, it's like the finger that points at the moon. One does not want to focus on the finger, but it's a useful pointing device. In Mahayana Buddhism, of which Zen is a part, one common analogy is that the teachings of the Buddha, including text based on the sermons, are like a boat that one rides to the other shore. Once you get across, you don't need to or want to carry the boat along with you anymore because it's an unnecessary burden. So I approached Chosunim's poems as a kind of hwadu practice. I read them and reread them many times, and I've willfully made it a point not to memorize them, either in the original Korean or in the translation. That's actually kind of hard to do, because when you reread poems, they sort of stick in your mind. But I tried on purpose not to let that happen, so that each time I looked at them, they would be fresh. And of course, I looked up many words, as translators generally do, but I did not memorize the etymologies or the definitions of those words. And so what I often discovered was I would look up the same word many times, and then each time I would look it up, I would learn something new about it. So even the practice of checking the Oh-hyun, or the dictionary, the 우리말 큰 사전, right, the big Korean dictionary, that was also a kind of revelatory practice for me. And in many of the poems, what I would often do is I would read the poem this way, but then because of the way Chosunim wrote the poem, if you read it straight down and read the Hangul as if they were Hanja, there was another poem in there, and that was not translatable. So I did the best that I could. So in the end, I consider all these translations both provisional and ephemeral. And when I look at them right now, I'm reminded that in Buddhism, the self is an illusion. These poems were translated by another self, an earlier ego self from an earlier time, and I can often see into the workings of that earlier consciousness, engaging with the consciousness that wrote those initial poems in Korean, and the confluence of those minds. In Korean, that would be the tongdal, the interpenetration of those minds, is what Chosunim's poems illustrate for me. Multiple facets of the poem, in both original and translation, they emerge and they sort of interpenetrate, and what they do is they illustrate the concept of tongdal. It's a very fundamental concept in Korean Zen. Now, the backstory of this whole process I thought would interest you, because my translations came out in a rather unexpected way. For example, I translate, I'm in the middle of retranslating Lee Mun-yeol's 황제를 위하여, a very difficult text full of Taoist imagery and Confucian imagery. And I've translated Hwang Sun-won, and I'm also doing a new annotation and translation of Kim Man-jung's Gueunmong. So I translate a range of difficult texts. But in 2010, I was invited to the Harvard Shijo Festival, and I had not known about Joseonim's poetry until I was invited to participate that year. And that night, I was actually teaching at the time, so I arrived late the first night, just after the events had concluded. And luckily, I got a program package before I checked into the hotel. And around midnight was when I finally got to bed, after browsing through the enclosed booklet, which included a few translations of Joseonim's poetry by David McCann, and a couple of others in the original Korean. So I looked at them, and they struck me as especially challenging. Joseonim was lucky to have somebody of David McCann's abilities, and because David McCann is a skillful poet in his own right, and having translated major poets, he didn't mention to you that he's translated Kim Ji-ha and Ko-eun. He was able to convey far more than the surface of the shijo that he had picked. But when I looked at the original texts, I saw that they were almost by definition impossible to translate. They had the sensibility of casual kongan and the same confounding of language. And coming from a Zen tradition, that was to be expected, and yet it was not the kind of challenge a translator would typically have to face. And I knew that Joseonim was scheduled to be at the conference and was expecting to meet him at breakfast the next morning. And I was hoping to be able to talk to him and also to Professor McCann about the challenge of translating his works. And so after quickly reading through the program booklet, I went to sleep. And a couple of hours later, I literally bolted straight up in bed, and I was awakened so suddenly from a dream that I initially didn't know where I was. I was totally disoriented. And then I noticed the alarm clock with the red LED letters, and it was 3:33. And the dream was so vivid, and it was also semi-lucid. In the dream, I knew I was dreaming. And so I remembered it very vividly. And I was walking in the mountains. And from the trail I was on, I could look across the valley, and I could see a range of snow-capped peaks across the horizon. And I had been traveling for some time, and I was tired. And I could feel the sweat on my body, and even the cool wind from that high elevation. And the air was really crisp, and also oddly thick. Often in a dream, air feels like water. You can actually feel the texture around you. And I was aware that I was in a dream, and also I knew I was a monk. I was wearing black robes, and I was carrying a staff. And I was approaching this mountaintop inn. It was actually a surjik on top of the mountain. And it had the typical banner, the wine cellar's flag outside. It was flapping in the wind, so I went inside to get something. And it was empty except for one customer. And he was sitting on the elevated wooden floor at a low table, and he was also wearing black robes. And I recognized his robes as the same order I belonged to. And he was wearing a sakat, a big straw rain hat. So when he was sitting at the table, he looked like a mushroom. And then as I stood over him and I introduced myself, he tilted his head back, and I could see his face. And he was relatively young, probably just late 30s, but I instantly recognized him as Oh-hyun S님. And I greeted him and introduced myself, and he said he had been expecting me. And he asked me to join him at his table, but as I began to put down my sack, he looked up at me, and he said very clearly, and these were very strange words. He said, "자네 한 불말 탈 때가 됐소." Okay? And just as he said "so," he raised his right hand and he blasted me right in the chest with a bolt of electricity. So the translation of that would be something like, "It's time for you to receive the language of Korean Buddhism." But all those words have multiple meanings, and every time I go back, there's more in there. And so he hits me with this blast of energy in the solar plexus, And that's what woke me up. That's what made me just bolt upright in bed with an electrical shock. And I was sweating. I had slept with the window open a crack, so that cool breeze I felt in the mountain might have been the air coming in from the street. But as I was remembering this dream, the first thing I wondered was why Oh-hyun S님 was so young. And I heard he was in his early 80s. And also, why was I wearing black robes and not gray Korean robes? It made sense to me that my dream self was wearing black robes because I actually wore a black Tibetan jacket to the conference, but I would have expected a Korean monk to be wearing gray. My body was still buzzing with that energy, and I couldn't get back to sleep. So I figured, even if this is just a message from my unconscious, it probably means I should translate those other poems. And so I stayed up and I translated the rest of the poems by him. And then I got another, I think I translated 3 poems, and then I got another hour of sleep, and then I learned in the morning that Oh-hyun S님 had not come, because that was the year of the SARS scare. He was afraid that he might get sick because of the air travel. So he had not come. And I ended up reading my translations at the festival, and that's also where I met Professor Kwon Young-min for the first time. And it's only earlier today, that I met Oh-hyun S님. Now, later, after the Harvard Shijo Festival, while I was doing research for my new translation of Kuunmong, which, for those of you who don't know, it's a 17th century Korean Buddhist classic by Kim Man-jung, and it's written in Korean but in Chinese characters. It took me many years to study the Tang Dynasty narratives that Kim Man-jung was referring to. I realized I couldn't translate it unless I knew what he was alluding to. So I was doing a lot of research on Chinese Buddhism, and I learned that the Chinese Zen monks, the Chan monks, wore black robes. And the mountains in my dream, on the one hand, they looked sort of like Soraksan in Korea, but they were also much taller. It's as if they were simultaneously Soraksan and the 5 sacred mountains of China and the 4 sacred mountains of Buddhism in China. If the monk I had met in the dream was of the same order, we were perhaps part of a lineage that went back to a Tang Dynasty Chinese Chan order. What the monk had said to me was very specific, and it was full of all that wordplay. And my initial understanding was that he was telling me it was time to learn the language of Korean Buddhism, but figuratively, it was also time for me to ride the horse of Korean Buddhism. 한 불말 탈 때가 됐다. Right? So, if you look at the lineage of Korean Zen, you'll see that Joseon belongs to the Kusan, or the 9 mountain Zen lineage. And the current name Joge was adopted in the year 826. Okay? And it traces all the way back into the Tang Dynasty to the monk Huineng, 638 through 713. He was the 6th and last patriarch of Chan Buddhism. And the lineage goes through Nanhui Huairang, who was 677 to 744, and then Mazu Daoyi, 709 to 788, and 3 others. Okay? But Mazu Daoyi was of special interest to me because in Korean, his name is Majo Do-il, and the Ma is a horse. That's a horse Ma. And he was known for strange words and extraordinary actions, just like Musan Oh-hyun, who earlier in his day was really quite infamous for his strange, extraordinary actions, like going dancing and doing all sorts of things that a monk was not supposed to do. The readings of the Chinese characters was a shock to me because Ma was horse, Cho also like grandfather or old man, and of course Do-il is Tao and Il is one. The Cho in Oh-hyun S님's name is a surname character, but it can also be read as the interior of a room, but it sounds the same as the Cho for old man or grandfather or forefather. And O in his name, he uses the Hanja for 5. That's homophonous for the sign of the horse. And actually, one reading of the O is swift horse. So I found that to be quite surprising. Now, actually, I'll talk a little bit more about this. The O can also be read as the O for to wake up, to awakening. Now, after my surprise at not seeing Chosunim the next day, I understood my dream meeting with him to be one of those interesting or ironic synchronicities. But that blast of energy that in my solar plexus had done its job, and the need to translate his poetry stayed with me like a form of practice. I'd actually been doing meditation for a couple of years then. I started after I recovered from almost 9 years of Lyme disease. I read his poems in Korean and then reflected on them while I did Vipassana meditation, so that I could retrace the associative trajectories through the skandhas. So according to Buddhism, these are form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Those are the 5 heaps that constitute our understanding and perception of mundane reality. And when you do Vipassana meditation, one of the things you're eventually able to do after the shamatha part of meditation is you can stop a thought, and you can then trace it all the way back to the original thing that produced the thought. So when I read his poems, I tried to do that for the effect the poem had on me. What could I trace it back to? And I monitored also my bodily sensations along with associative connections in keeping with the body scanning process of Vipassana meditation. Because I was also practicing Qigong, partially for health. But one of the things that you can do in Vipassana is you can monitor body sensations. So if I want to, I can feel right here just by thinking about it. And when you experience a poem and you feel the sensations or the imagery, you can also trace those connections to parts of your body or senses of movement. So that's another thing I did for these poems. And then I tried to maintain those network of associations and sensations as I recreated the poem in English. So my translation was based not so much on the words, but what effect did they have? And then how could I make the possible range of words fit with the effect? Okay. So the process was not so much that of translating a word or an element, but what in structuralism might be called the deep structure, the relationship among the elements in the poem, and then the relationship between the words and the reader, and then the relationship among the relationships evoked by the words in both contexts. The epigraph that begins this the conference volume, "The Moon in the Water," that is Musan Oh-hyun alluding to the Song of Enlightenment. That's called the Jungdoga by the great Tang Dynasty monk Yongja Shwanje, who's known in Korean as Yongga Hyongak. And then to provide a context for the epigraph, let me quote a few additional lines from the Song of Enlightenment. It says, "It is not hard to see forms in a mirror, but the moon in the water, who can grasp it? One moon is reflected in all waters. All moons in all waters are in that one moon." So that's the full context of that little epigraph. In Korean, Tongdal, which is a primary concept in Korean Buddhism, we usually translate it as interpenetration. That can be also read as penetrating the moon. And it's conveyed through a concept of non-obstruction, which the term used in Korean is mu'e. It's another central principle. And that was pursued by the great monk Wonhyo from the Silla period, 617 through 686. And therefore also the Hwaom, or the flower garland school of Korean Buddhism. Okay. And if you look at Musan Chohyun's preface, it's one of the story shijo that Professor Kwon has described in the introduction. And its use of the allusion to the moon on water is a poetic illustration of the concept of tongdal. In fact, you can even see the wordplay, right? Tong and dal. Dal is in the tong of the water too. And a man trying to grasp the moon in the water penetrates it, because if you try to reach the reflection, your hand will go through it. But he is likewise penetrated by the moon's light, because he saw it. The moonlight went into him. But the moonlight is itself an illusion, since it's actually the reflection of the sun's light. The man can't grasp the moon, but he can realize its light has penetrated him. There's also some poetic humor here, maybe even a warning, since the story of the great Tang poet Li Po's death goes that he drowned when he tried to embrace the moon on the water. And in Musan Cho-hyun's preface, the man leaves through the temple gate after his realization about the moon, just as the sun comes up. And the source of the light reflected from that moon is just coming up as he leaves. Okay? So in a sense, that's the function of Musan Cho-hyun's Zen Shijo, to point you at the original source of that light. And that means the vehicle, the boat, is disposable afterwards. And each time you go back to it, you can see something else in it. Okay? Yongga Hyungak also said, "Neither try to eliminate delusion, nor search for what is real. This is because ignorance, just as it is the Buddha nature. This worldly body itself, which appears and disappears like a phantom, is nothing other than the reality of life. When you actually wake up to the reality of life, there is not any particular thing to which you can point and say, 'This is it.'" And if you look at many of the poems I collected for this edition, you will see those principles coming up again and again. And likewise in the poems of Musan Cho-hyun, they illustrate the concreteness of this kind of transcendence of binary distinctions by using, in many cases, something absolutely commonplace as an illustrative image. So for example, in the poem My Lifelines, he writes, "What I've been seeking all my life are the main lines, the veins of Zen and poetry. The conclusion I reached today: poetry is wood grain, knotted, and Zen is wood's grain, straight." And I hope my translations help you perceive this transcendence in the mundane, the straight and knotted grains, in your own reading of Musan Cho-hyun's poems. Thank you.